Millions of pages were written and countless hours of speeches were made on British colonialism in India. Several motives were attributed to them for subjugating Indian rulers. But none of us might have heard the reason in the words of the person who defeated Bengal Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah and laid foundations for the British Empire in India, which transformed Britain from a tiny island of irrelevance to the most powerful global power. Let's hear from Robert Clive in his words as written by him in a letter in 1764.
The last election of the India Directors of East India Company drew many unjust attacks on my character, and it is probable I may be censured by some for having suffered such reports as were spread against me during the contest to have remained so long unanswered, but knowing that even the authors of them could not themselves believe them, and conscious to myself that every part of my conduct, in the great share I had in the management of the company's affairs, would bear the most rigid scrutiny, and the more known be the more approved, I held them in too much contempt to merit any answer. But as I find the unjust attack on my character has been followed by an attack on my fortune, and insinuations thrown out to justify these proceedings, very injurious to my honor, I reluctantly submit to vindicate myself, and must rely upon the candor of the proprietors, not to impute it to ostentatious vanity, if in speaking of myself I do aver that I founded all my actions in their service on honorable motives. To state this clearly, I am obliged to go back to that period when commerce was the company's sole object. The first principle on which the company's settlements were established was entirely commercial. The Mughal government had, during the long and wise administration of Aurangzeb, taken such deep root that the many nations which formed the empire of Hindostan were subjugated to the Mughal in various forms, some of them tributary and hereditary, and others governed by nabobs, or viceroys, under the immediate appointment of the emperors. Such was the fate of the empire when the English settled in India, and, in the reign of Firrukhsir, they obtained royal grants for establishing themselves in Bengal, Madras, and Surat, with privilege of trading duty-free, and a grant of a certain district of land to settle upon, and liberty to fortify and govern themselves by their own laws. But as the English saw no violence to be apprehended from a people who had a just idea of commerce, and a government at the time well administered, they built with very little view of defense, and carried on their trade free from oppression. The governors of the distant provinces, discovering the weakness to which the power of the emperor was reduced by the invasion of Nadir Shah, were no longer restrained by fear. Each assumed and exercised sovereign authority over his province, and looked on his government as an heritage to his family. Scarce any more of the annual sums, before paid by them to the Mughal, were sent to court, and, to maintain themselves in their sovereignty, they levied forces far beyond what the ordinary revenues would maintain. From hence oppressions became necessary, and, in their turn, the Europeans were oppressed, not only in their trade, but large sums extorted from them by violence. Monsieur Dupleix, the governor of Pondicherry, was the first who took the alarm, and was the first who discovered the superiority of European discipline, and from hence was led into the idea of acquiring a territorial sovereignty in India. It is probable he at first extended his views no farther than a district round Pondicherry, but when once engaged in the politics of the country, his successes so far surpassed his expectation, and opened such a scene of power to him, that he disdained the narrow limits he might at first prescribe to himself, and no doubt but they were enlarged, not only to the conquest of the Carnatic, but to the extirpation of all other European nations, and even to the reduction of the whole Mughal Empire, and to make it a dependent etat on the crown of France. The English beheld his progress with astonishment, but were not roused to action, till they found themselves on the point of being swallowed up by the French power. Forced to it, they with reluctance, in 1750, undertook the support of Muhammad Ali against Chanda Sahib, under whose name the French carried on their ambitious projects. It is not my intention to enter into a minute detail of that long war, maintained on our side against a constant superiority of numbers, at the expense of the lives of many thousands of brave men, and at the risk of near £1,000,000 sterling of the company's property. I shall only observe that from our successes, the Nabob's situation was so different at the end of the year 1753 from what it was in 1750, at which time the single city of Trichinopoli was the only part of his dominions that remained unconquered by the French, that in 1753 he had recovered, and was master of, almost the whole Carnatic, and at the time the French resources seemed nearly exhausted. The French company, elated at the success which attended Monsieur Dupleix in the commencement of the war, at first saintly approved his measures, but the opposition of the other European powers, the unforeseen events of war, and the deviating so widely from their natural object of commerce, rendering the event very uncertain, there was nothing could fix their faith in the rectitude of those measures, but successes that might attend them, and a happy period to the war, which Monsieur Dupleix promised them in every letter. But, instead of these successes, they saw the countries, of which they expected the revenues would be their reward, in the hands of their enemies, and their stock exhausting in the support of an uncertain war, which ruined their trade, and the manufactories of the country, from which they had before reaped advantages suitable to their establishment. The war appeared in the same light to the English company, and therefore both agreed on a neutrality for the Carnatic, till means should be found to put an end to that and all future wars by negotiations at home. But as it regarded the Carnatic only, it did not check the progress of the French arms in the Deccan, the Suba of which had ceded to the Milapatnam, and 4 provinces, which yielded then a revenue of 400,000 sterling a year. Nor did there appear any check to their progress in that country. The French gave law, by their influence over the Suba, to a country as extensive and populous as France, and by a prudent management of what they had so acquired, or by increase of dominion, it was in their power even then to have laid a foundation on which Monsieur Dupleix's great ideas of conquest might have been realized. And although French company themselves should have chosen to adhere to their commercial interests, Monsieur Dupleix's projects suited too well with that spirit of conquest which prevails in the French court, to be neglected, and upon the breaking out of the war it is reasonable to conclude, from the forces sent out under General Lawley, that they adopted them in their utmost extent. Our settlements were but a secondary object. Their forces were so formidable, that they, with great probability, imagined them a trifling obstacle, which surmounted, Cape Comorin and the Ganges might have been the boundaries of their dominions. The spirited efforts of Mr. Pocock could not prevent their landing their army. St. David's fell, no obstacle but Fort St. George remained to the accomplishment of their farther conquests. Here they met with a resistance suitable to the importance of the object, and I am persuaded that Messrs. Pigot, Lawrence, Draper, and many other gentlemen of the garrison would have been buried under its ruins, sooner than have surrendered the place. The siege was raised, their army reduced, and misfortunes pressed them on every side. Prior to the siege of Madras, they had lost all their settlements in Bengal. 400 Europeans, sent under Colonel Ford into the Deccan, by the great success of that gallant officer, put a period to their expectations in that country. The reduction of Masulipatam, the 4 northern provinces, and the making all the French army their prisoners, greatly contributed to our success at Fort St. George, as it diverted a great part of the French forces, who otherwise would have been called to the siege of Madras, and deprived them of supplies of money and provisions, and finally, as Colonel Ford's expedition obliged the French to send from the coast 500 men for the relief of Masulipatam, of whom very few returned to Pondicherry, the French were reduced to act upon the defensive only, and were greatly distressed for money and provisions, which Fort St. George was plentifully supplied with from Bengal. Under these circumstances, the fall of Pondicherry closed the scene of all their glory, and left them not a foot of land in India.
That's all for now. Please like, share, and subscribe to Deccan Diaries for regular updates. Have a good day.